Welcome to this week's episode of Taiwan Tech Update, your weekly roundup of tech news stories from here in Taiwan, presented by me, Tomasz Koper, and Radio Taiwan International. As you surely know, there are eye-watering amounts of money underpinning the ongoing AI boom and the associated demand for Taiwanese semiconductors. That's why investors big and small, especially here in Taiwan, watched with bated breath as TSMC stock price went on a bit of a roller coaster ride this week. You might be surprised how crucial the company is to Taiwan's national economy. That's why for this week's featured interview, I spoke with economist Paul Cavey, the founder of the platform East Asia Econ, about the weight of TSMC for Taiwan's economy and how the AI boom is playing out here and in other tech-focused economies in East Asia. Stick around to the second half of the show for that. But first, as always, we start with the roundup of Taiwan-related tech news stories for the week of June 6th to June 12th. The Research Institute for Democracy, Society, and Emerging Technology, or DCED, held its annual forum in Taipei this Saturday, bringing together domestic and international experts from different domains across a number of panels. Taiwan Power Company Vice President Wu Jinzhong said that the Taiwanese government is planning to set up around 160 electrical microgrids to boost the country's power grid resilience. Microgrids are small power networks that can generate, store, and distribute energy within a limited area. They can be connected to wider networks or operate independently during emergencies. Wu said that Taiwan must adopt a more distributed approach to power grid management. The country experienced major blackout incidents in 2021 and 2022 caused by human error, which exposed vulnerabilities in the current highly centralized system. Other experts on the same panel suggested Taiwan should mitigate geopolitical vulnerabilities by improving energy self-sufficiency and restarting nuclear power generation. During a separate panel, American researcher and author of the best-selling Chip War, Chris Miller, said that the outcome of the technology competition between the US and China will depend not only on AI development, but also on the manufacturing capacity and the supply chains that support it. He highlighted the different approaches by Washington and Beijing. The former is betting on innovation and technological leadership, while the latter is banking on industrial capacity and manufacturing scale. Like Washington, Taipei is also betting on AI innovation, but the industry continues to depend on raw materials, mainly rare earths, controlled by China. He concluded by saying that the coming years will give us a real-world test of the effectiveness of these two approaches. On Monday, Taiwan's stock market took a bit of a nosedive following a tech stock sell-off in the United States on Friday last week. The market dipped by more than 2,600 points in early trading, with TSMC seeing the largest intraday decline in the company's history. A single share dropped in price by around $4.20. Within less than a day, the company's market cap shrank by roughly $111 billion. You can probably see why this fall had everyone and their grandmother glued to screens with real-time stock price graphs. Other big players like Yageo, ASE Group, Foxconn, known here as Honhai, and Delta Electronics fell by around 7%. Analysts from Taishin Securities said that market players were concerned whether the AI boom might end early due to rising interest rates, adding that investors were moving away from overheated AI stocks and rotating into other sectors. That means we're not seeing anything like the dot-com crash in 2000, at least not yet. Now, TSMC later recovered due to smaller investors buying the dip, but the price graph, at least zoomed in on this week, still resembled a very exciting roller coaster. Zoom out, however, and the recent fluctuations become barely visible, sitting at the very peak of an almost logarithmic growth curve over the last 3 years. That, of course, carries its own risks, and I had the pleasure of learning about them and more from my guest this week, Paul Cavey. Stick around for the interview later in this episode. Also on Monday, the National Institute of Cybersecurity signed a memorandum of understanding with Microsoft. Their cooperation will focus on threat intelligence, AI-enabled defense, zero-trust architecture, and expanding public-private partnerships. Microsoft's North Asia head of public affairs, Marcus Bartley-Johns, said the MOU was a symbolic milestone of the company's cooperation with Taiwan. He added that the AI era is bringing enormous opportunities, but also a variety of threats. That's why it's crucial to have the resources to quickly detect vulnerabilities. Microsoft is currently evaluating the use of multi-agent and multi-model architectures to further improve its cybersecurity capabilities. On Tuesday, TSMC CFO Wendell Huang said he is not ruling out raising prices on the company's products due to inflationary pressures driving up costs. As you probably know, the company makes chips for giants like Nvidia, AMD, and Apple, so a price hike will not only affect AI infrastructure, but also, in the long run, consumer electronics. Huang said, however, that we're not looking at a sudden several-fold increase. He also addressed the company's stock price fluctuations and said that the AI boom is not a bubble about to burst, and said that TSMC's clients are hyperscalers with strong financials, which will allow them to continue investing. I will add here that even industry titans are running out of cash on hand and are starting to finance their infrastructure build-outs on credit. That's why I remain somewhat less optimistic about the industry than Mr. Huang. On Wednesday, the Taiwan Space Agency, or TASA, released 15 photographs from the recently launched Formosat 8A, the first in the Formosat 8 constellation. The high-resolution images offer an eye-in-the-sky view of both major infrastructure sites and verdant nature. TASA said the images were taken at a resolution of 1 meter, but were later enhanced to bring out more detail. Formosat 8A can photograph the same spot up to once per day, so there's a higher chance for clear images without cloud cover obstructing the view. I highly encourage you to check out the images for yourself. Unfortunately, the English version of the agency's website has not yet been updated at the time of writing, so go visit their Facebook page instead. And also on Wednesday, the U.S. media outlet Axios reported that a group of Republican House representatives in the U.S. are pushing for strict enforcement of patent laws in a case against TSMC, currently investigated by the U.S. International Trade Commission. This could potentially result in a ban on imports of chips found to be on the wrong side of the law. The group said in a letter to the ITC chair that some of TSMC's most advanced chips infringe on patents Marlin Semiconductor bought from Taiwan's United Microelectronics Corporation in 2021. What's interesting here is that Democratic lawmakers from Arizona had warned previously that actions against TSMC could disrupt chip production, AI development, defense systems, and Arizona's economy. TSMC claims that it follows the laws in all countries where it operates. There was a lot of TSMC in the news this week, and that's mainly because of how important it is to the Taiwanese and increasingly global economy. That's why this week I spoke about this and more with Paul Cavey, an economist and the founder of the platform East Asia Econ. And this is how our conversation went. Paul, earlier this week, Taiwan watched with bated breath as TSMC stock dipped in a record-breaking single-day decline. But in context, that was just a blip, and the company has been rising meteorically over the last 3 years, really. Can you give us a sense of how important TSMC has become to the Taiwanese economy in general?
So it's obviously a huge driver of the economy and very important. And, I think around now, the market capitalization is around 40% maybe of market capitalization, maybe higher. And if we look at figures like contribution to CapEx, contribution to exports, and so on, TSMC is significant. And the kind of the closest parallel I think we can think about in this really is something like Nokia in Finland in sort of the 2000s time, when you have such a big company driving both stock market performance. I think Nokia was about 70% of market capitalization in Finland at the peak. And also having a big impact on the economy. And I think two questions for investors, depending, what bit of the market people look at. Obviously, for equity investors, it's about TSMC, and therefore it's all about what is demand for TSMC's products in the rest of the world, because obviously it is a global company. It's not really selling a lot within Taiwan. So that's the question for equity investors, and therefore why a fall in TSMC's share price is important. But there's also people who are interested in what happens with the currency and what happens with interest rates and what happens therefore with the macro economy in Taiwan. There's also the issue of if TSMC is stronger or weaker, then that has a big impact on the domestic economy in Taiwan. And that's more of the issues that I'm focused on and trying to think about.
What kind of impact are we seeing from TSMC and just the tech sector in general? Because, I mean, besides TSMC, we also have other giants in the space located here in Taiwan.
Yeah, and I think there's some debate about it. One school of thought is that because it's only one company, therefore the growth that Taiwan's seeing is very narrow. The feed through to the domestic economy is therefore weak. And this is, as people talk about in the US and other economies, it's like this K-shaped economy. Growth is uneven. It's only really being seen in a few sectors. Not everybody is benefiting. And obviously, in all of these things, there's something to all of that, right? Like it's not like I'm sitting in the countryside in Yunlin at the moment, and if you look around, it's sort of not really evident what the impact of TSMC is on this area of the country. That said, I think there's also another school of thought, which is where I would where I'd sit more in, and that is that it's just, two things really. So one, that it's just such a big company relative to the size of the domestic economy, that what matters, or what happens in TSMC does have feed through to the rest of the economy. So I think that's one point to be bearing in mind. And the second thing is that I think, if we look at the GDP statistics, Taiwan's economy is just growing. It's unprecedented what's happening in Taiwan's economy at the moment. And a lot of it is because of TSMC and the broader tech sector. And the way to illustrate that really is, GDP growth in real terms was 10% or thereabouts last year. It's going to be about 10% this year, according to most forecasts. This is happening in an economy which is already rich in GDP per capita terms. So this kind of growth is extraordinary. If we look at the manufacturing sector as a percentage of GDP, it's 35% of GDP. It's very difficult to find an economy in the world at the moment where the manufacturing sector is higher. And if we look at manufacturing employment as a percentage of total employment, that's also high in Taiwan relative to the rest of the world. And obviously a lot of this is because of TSMC directly, but also the feed through from TSMC and the semiconductor sector to the rest of the economy. And the final point I would say is, if we look at wage growth in Taiwan, and obviously this is a key issue for voters, for individuals, and something which is often a complaint, and in the services sector in particular, you can understand why that would be, given wages are low. However, there are now signs that wage growth in Taiwan is accelerating. It's, in manufacturing sector running at about 4% year on year at the moment, which in global terms is not actually that low anymore. And I think, again, a lot of that can be traced with the power and the growth that's happening with TSMC and the broader economy.
Do you think that the Taiwanese economy is relying too heavily on its tech sector? I have heard the term Dutch disease thrown around in the past. What's your take on that?
People use that term, but I think it's wrong. If anything, Taiwan has sort of like the opposite of the Dutch disease, in the sense that in the kind of the typical example of the Dutch disease, you have a commodity sector of the economy, which benefits from rising producer prices. Like, so oil price goes up, and obviously Saudi Arabia would benefit from that in terms of the terms of trade. Because of that, the currency appreciates, and that currency appreciation pushes manufacturing companies out of business. That's basically sort of the logic behind it. Now Taiwan differs in two ways from that. So the first thing is that there has been no appreciation of the currency. So that typical way in which the Dutch disease is supposed to impact the rest of the economy, it clearly isn't happening in Taiwan because the currency isn't moving. And so I think that's an important differentiation. The second thing is this Dutch disease idea, it's very much focused on commodity producers and so sort of like natural resources. So whether that's oil or copper or any of those things. And again, the difference in Taiwan is this is a highly productive manufacturing sector that is lifting the rest of the economy. And so you would expect that the feed through from this to the rest of the manufacturing sector and the economy more broadly is going to be much more positive than it would be just if it was the prices of a fixed commodity which is rising. So I would think that Taiwan doesn't have the Dutch disease. My point about having the opposite of the Dutch disease is because there's no exchange rate appreciation, and therefore business are probably staying in business that actually probably should be going out of business. And so I don't think Dutch disease is an issue. That said, the other part of your question is, about is the economy too dependent on semiconductors? And again, I'd answer that in two ways. So the first thing, it's very difficult to make that argument at the moment in the sense that clearly the dividend from the semiconductor sector to the economy is enormous and very beneficial in many, many ways. And so the fact that Taiwan has a very big semiconductor sector is important. The second part of the issue is what happens next? Because clearly, if TSMC, as you talked about, the share price did dip this week, but it's still doing extremely well. There clearly isn't a bear market at the moment. But at some point, this run in the semiconductor sector is probably going to end. And if you look again at somewhere like Finland, when the run in Nokia ended, it has a big impact on the rest of the economy. So, it would seem to me that it would be beneficial to the economy, actually, if the currency was appreciating at the moment, as much as that would be painful to some of the other manufacturing sectors that are trying to export. It is the sort of thing that would raise household incomes, boost consumption, and therefore provide growth to the economy beyond the semiconductor sector that perhaps we're not seeing at the moment.
You mentioned possibly the AI boom, the run on AI possibly ending. What would be the worst case scenario if that happened or when that happens for Taiwan?
You can sort of see two things happening. So one, a sharp deceleration in growth. And I think that would be negative for, all the things I've talked about, the reversal of the things we've talked about so far. So, wage growth overall in the economy would slow, dividend payments on the stock market would come down, asset prices generally would be under a lot of pressure. So there would be that negative impact. And the second thing then is how persistent is that slowdown? And so this is, again, one of the critical issues in thinking about Taiwan at the moment. And this is as much more of a question for technology experts, perhaps, rather than economists. But the question is, how structural or cyclical is this phenomenon that's playing out in the semiconductor space at the moment? It doesn't feel like it's just a normal cycle. It feels like at least there's more sustainability to it. And so I think that then informs what we would think about in terms of the scenario when growth begins to slow down in the semiconductor sector. How sharp is that fall down going to be? If this is a cyclical phenomenon, cycles, they can come down very sharply. If it's a structural change that we're seeing, then I'd imagine, we're still going to see bad years, but it's not going to be as sharp a deceleration as, might be seen in, for example, the memory sector in the semiconductor space going back over the years, when you just see these very sharp ups and downs in prices. The cycle doesn't feel quite like that, particularly for TSMC. But if if TSMC has a problem, the economy is going to have a problem.
Taiwan is often compared to Korea because of reliance on high-tech industries. One company in particular being dominant in the market, TSMC here and Samsung in Korea. But Taiwan has also been compared to other East Asian powerhouses, Japan and China. How does that comparison look like right now in 2026 in terms of how these other players are managing their industries and managing the risks associated with that?
So if we take the example of Korea to begin with, there's two important differences between Taiwan and Korea at the moment. So one is that when we look at the importance of semiconductors in the overall economy, in Korea, semiconductor is about 25-ish% of exports at the moment. They've been going up a lot because prices are rising so much, but about 25%. If we look at exports in Taiwan, like semiconductors are 60-70% of overall exports. And so the rise in the semiconductor cycle is much more important to Taiwan's economy than it is to Korea. The second thing is that Korea and Taiwan obviously specialize in different parts of the semiconductor market. So Korea is much more about memory. Obviously, Taiwan and TSMC is, foundry made to order semiconductors. And the importance of that in thinking about what the domestic economic impact is that in Korea, the growth that's being seen at the moment is much more about the increase in prices. In Taiwan, the improvement in growth is much more about productivity and overall increases in production. So if we take nominal GDP growth in both economies, it wouldn't be growing that differently at the moment. Very high double-digit GDP growth in nominal terms in both economies. But in Korea, that's much more because of, if we look at real GDP growth, it's much slower. If we look at Taiwan, real GDP growth is the dominant driver of that overall increase in nominal GDP. So why is that differentiation important? Because in Taiwan, it is much more about a productivity story. And a productivity story, therefore, has much more sort of implications for the rest of the economy. So when we compare Korea and Taiwan, there's these two differences. That one, the semiconductor side in Taiwan is bigger. The second thing is more of what's happening in the economy is about productivity. Less is just about prices. Now, if you look at the rest of the region, and the areas that I look at most are like China and also Japan, both of those economies are also seeing benefits of, or being, there are clear economic impacts of what's happening in semiconductors in both economies. And so in Japan, the semiconductor sector is much smaller and exports are smaller as a percentage of GDP, so it's not as dominant. But if we look at export prices in Taiwan, in Japan, which is an important topic at the moment, because when economists think about the impact of energy price hikes on domestic economies, one of the transmission mechanisms for that is via the terms of trade. Now, the terms of trade is just the difference between export prices and import prices. And so if energy prices go up a lot, that's potentially very damaging for the economy. But even in somewhere like Japan, because of what's happening with AI and semiconductors, export prices right now are also rising. So that helps to offset the impact of the energy stuff that's happening and increased prices there. And so likely the economic impact of the Iran war on Japan will be less than it otherwise would be. The second one then is China. And if we look at China, there's a couple of interesting things. So one is that unlike the rest of the region, China has a big deficit in semiconductor trade, so it imports more than it exports. And obviously a lot of that is coming from Korea and Taiwan specifically. The second thing, though, is that right now, export growth in semiconductors in China is much quicker than import growth. So export growth is rising 100% year on year. Import growth is about 50%. The reason that there's still a trade deficit is because the starting point is different. So exports are much lower in level terms. But obviously what this means is over the course of time, if this trend persists, then actually we will see China becoming more self-sufficient in semiconductors. And then that has implications for demand from Korea and demand from Taiwan going forward. So there are quite a lot of important changes going on in the region because of this semiconductor cycle.
Thank you so much for your time, Paul Cavey, economist and the founder of the platform East Asia Econ.
Great. Thanks very much for the discussion.
And that's all I have for you in this week's edition of Taiwan Tech Update. Thank you for staying with me, and if you have any ideas or opinions on the show, its format, topics, or just technology in general, you can email them to me at Tomasz, that's TOMASZ, at rti.org.tw. Please include Taiwan Tech Update or TTU in the subject line. I'm your host, Tomasz Koper, and I'll be back with another update next week.